Hello and welcome to the Theology podcast brought to you by Whitfinstock Publishers. My name is Zach Mickle. I'm on staff here at Whitfinstock, and I'm also the host of this podcast, which consists of interviews with leading authors and thinkers in theology, biblical studies, and philosophy. So on this episode, I talk with Dr. Colby Dickinson to hear about his new book, Haunted Words, Haunted Selves, Listening to Otherness Within Western Thought. Colby is a professor of theology at Loyola University Chicago and the author of a handful of other books, including a critical introduction and guide to Giorgio Agamben's Homo Sacer series, as well as a 2020 book with Cascade entitled Theology as Autobiography, the Centrality of Confession, Relationship, and Prayer to the Life of Faith. So with that, let's jump on over to the interview. Thanks so much for listening, and we hope you enjoy this episode. All right, I'm here with Professor Colby Dickinson, who is the author of recently published Cascade book, Haunted Words, Haunted Selves, Listening to Others Within Western Thought. So thanks very much for joining us, Colby. To get us started, since you're a first-time guest, could you share with our listeners maybe a bit about yourself, maybe what you do for work, and also what topics your writing focuses on?
Yeah, sure. And first, thanks for having me too. Pleasure to be here. I live in Chicago and I teach at Loyola University Chicago, and I am a professor of theology there, and I sort of straddle the border between philosophy or continental philosophy and theology or philosophy of religion, kind of in those areas in general. And I also love to fly fish, and I like to run. And when I'm when I'm feeling healthy and back in shape, it's been a weird summer, I will be eager to do more of those things. But I'm kind of at the moment focusing with my work on lots of things. I mean, I recently published a book on Giorgio Agamben's Homo Sacer series, and I've written about Agamben before and the Agamben and Theology volume years ago. And so he's definitely a touchstone in my work. I also write about a lot of trends that deal with sort of apophatic theology, mysticism. I'm getting more into that lately. I did a book on Theology's Autobiography where I was talking about sort of reconceptualizing the process and methodology of theology by looking at autobiographical narratives and memoirs as a primary source for theology rather than just like anecdotal evidence of how to do theology. And I mean, that's among other things. I would say that characterizes a good deal of what I've done. Yeah.
Nice. Very good. Very good. So so I'm just learning as you're talking right now that it's pronounced Homo Sacer. Is that how you pronounced it?
Yeah, or the Homo Sacer series. I think
Homo
the C
Sacer.
in Latin, it always depends with is it a medieval pronunciation of the C or an
Oh, okay.
of the C? They sometimes say it differently, and yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm not
You said it
I'm
out
not gonna
loud, and I was like, "Damn it! I've been pronouncing it wrong this whole time. I had no idea."
you know what? I don't even know if I'm saying it right. I always say Homo Sacer, but it
Okay.
could yeah, you could say other things too, I'm sure.
Nice. Very cool. Okay, so kind of an opener question that we put forward to all of our guests, which I'm going to put to you as well, is if you could place any three thinkers, they can be dead or alive, you could put them together in a room and listen in on their conversation. Which three thinkers would you choose, and why would you choose those three?
I think I would, and it's a great question, and I love thinking about these kinds of things. I think obviously I would choose Hegel. Oh my goodness, just I would love to see what that man is up to in his thoughts and the wealth of knowledge that would pour forth. I think I would like to see Leonardo da Vinci, this eclectic
Oh, nice.
genius throughout history, and I'd love to see interactions between a philosopher and someone who's more immersed in art and visual art and just so much there. And maybe Adrian Rich, the poet, one of my
Mm.
favorites. I just could only imagine the unusual conversations that would be generated between three individuals like that. And I'd
Sure.
just like be a fly on the wall taking it in.
Sure. Is there like some thread through that conversation that you'd be hoping to hear about? Because it is a pretty eclectic group.
It's pretty clear. Obviously, cooking, cleaning, no. Favorite dishes, no. Really, I think I just would be so curious to see where would the conversation go of its own accord. Like, would Hegel find it interesting to talk about 20th century lesbianism? Would
Yeah.
Adrian Rich find it interesting to think about Da Vinci being gay back in the Renaissance? Would like what things would actually come up as conversational that you would never anticipate that they would want to discuss? That would intrigue me. Where would three brilliant thinkers gravitate toward in a conversation with one another, where there's so much difference lying between them? They'd have to find some commonalities, or I guess your raw humanity might be exposed in some way. And to me, that would be so intriguing. Maybe they talk about dating and relationships. I mean, who knows, right?
Yeah,
Who knows?
yeah, yeah. Yeah, it'd be like one of those conversations I feel like, well, I don't know, in my imagination anyways, where it's like it takes like 10, 15 minutes before they kind of get off the ground trying to figure out what the heck they're going to talk about. But then it actually gets really interesting the more and more they talk.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so for this book, Haunted Words, Haunted Selves, could you maybe just say a little bit about kind of what the genesis was of this book? So what prompted you to write it?
Yeah. So I think I even said in the acknowledgments to the book, maybe I can't remember at this point. It's like you write a book and then it's like 2 years later you actually see it in
Yeah.
print. But one of my friends and colleagues, Justin Sands, he teaches in South Africa. he's I swear to God, he's probably one of my few diligent readers in the world. And so he'll sometimes teach things I write, which still blows my mind that even happens. But he will do that. And I think we were on email or Zoom or something. And he said, I love teaching some of your stuff to my students, but God, it gets so theoretically dense. Do you think you could write something that's like simpler and explains kind of the background of your thought, quote unquote, and like maybe that would be helpful. Just write a simple take on what matters to you and the work that you've done. And I was like, huh, yeah, I could try that. So I literally,
Nice.
based on this almost like a dare from Justin, I was like, okay, you know what? I'm going to try and write a book that tries to simply explain the core of what I do. Where do some of the big ideas come from? And that book was the result. I mean, I feel like I cobbled some things together that I've been thinking through more recently. But I also went and wrote some original stuff that was taking up Justin's claims directly, and I felt it all kind of flowed together somewhat well. And so I thought, okay, I'm just going to put this forward as like this is what I've been working on in my work for all these years, and I really love the idea of the hauntedness, which I had borrowed from the philosopher Jacques Derrida, who talked about a hauntology, how every time we think we have an identity, we think we have a voice, we think we have something to say, we've written a book, whatever. There's always going to be some element that we've not thought through that kind of haunts us and is part of us. It's the unstated force within our identity that kind of deconstructs it, takes it apart. It's deeply psychological for me. So
Mhm.
I was working on the book thinking it also was a way of me wrestling with myself and wrestling with all my writing and the way in which I conceive of who I am as a writer, as an author. So that was kind of coming out in the work as well, and I really enjoyed listening to that other side of things as I wrote. I hope that helps explain like the kind of the base
Yeah.
that kicked it off for me.
Yeah, absolutely, it does. No, I think what you're describing is like the hardest thing for a lot of theologians and philosophers to do is to write something that people can actually read and understand. So, I read the whole book. I think you've done a good job of it.
Well,
I mean,
thank
I'm
you.
used to reading dense stuff, so maybe I have a higher threshold than some people would. Certainly not as high as people who are like full time in the academy, but no, I thought you pulled it off well. I thought it was very readable and like you said, kind of autobiographical in a way to draw from one of your themes. So I think you've already kind of gotten into this a bit, talking about hauntology and your own journey writing the book. But if you had to give like sort of maybe something a little longer than an elevator pitch, right? But like maybe like a quick 2-3 minute description of what the book is about. How would you sort of go about describing it?
Yeah, I guess I would say there are multiple areas of my work and work that's related to what other people do in these fields that we are just getting to a point sort of late 20th century, mid to late 20th century, and currently as well, where people are asking questions about what are the things that have been neglected? What are the things we haven't looked at? And for me, that's such a deeply psychological principle as well. It's like I need to take the time to say, how is my sense of being a man something that, neglects women or neglects other voices, not, non-binary genders, et cetera? Where does it being a Westerner neglect the non-Western other? Where does, my sense of being a philosopher who thinks deep thoughts all day neglect the ordinary, quote
Yeah.
unquote, the ordinary person? So all these things began to seep into my thinking, where I thought, it's interesting that you don't read many philosophers who take account of their own life, even their personal life, or their stance, standpoint that they come from, in order to think about the work that they do in a different way. And I think for me, especially when I teach, I've always been hyper conscious of that. I want to be including myself and who I am in the work that I do. And even if I'm writing things that ostensibly don't look like they're about me, no, a lot of times they always are. It's always something to do with what is it that I'm looking at in myself and who I am that speaks to me powerfully about the undoing of my own identity. So I was curious to read different philosophers and think about, where does their life play a role? How do they write about the role of the autobiographical in their work? And that's one of the chapters in the book. Where do I look at the areas of, sovereign forms of identity, and where those need to come undone within myself and within the work I do? So there were lots of themes like this that I was picking up and playing with in each of the chapters, trying to understand how a lot of us, I mean, every one of us strives in some way so hard to have a solid identity, a sense of self. But then there are these moments where we realize that they come undone. And as an academic, I need to be particularly attentive to that dynamic in my own work. Where does my work come undone because it challenges me personally in ways I may not even want to confront? So I was trying to wrestle with that in the work that I do, which honestly probably is, I mean, not probably. This is the wager of what I'm talking about here. It obviously goes back to even my own story. I was raised in a church setting, and then I was asking critical questions about what does that mean to be religious or to be Christian, and I was asking questions that were not always welcomed when your dad's a minister. And so for me, even very, very, very personally, I was asking questions about this, what haunts me here in my own life that I need to look at critically. And even my profession comes out of some of those questions from my childhood that definitely have shaped what I do. And it hopefully comes out in the book in many ways too.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Okay, so this whole idea of like hauntings or hauntology that you mentioned already, which thinkers are you kind of drawing from when you use that language? I know you mentioned Derrida already, but who are you kind of drawing from? Are there others, or how does Derrida sort of use that language too?
Yeah, Derrida, I think, was probably one of the first in a strictly I shouldn't say strictly, but in a more philosophical context, who was developing this idea of a hauntology, like in his book Spectres of Marx. He's talking about how we every time we construct a normative sense of self or a narrative, like in a book, there's always something that haunts it and threatens to deconstruct it. And so his whole deconstructivist project, in many ways, was something he called a hauntology. It's trying to find that ghost that haunts us, that we try to maybe repress or ignore or don't want to pay attention to. But when it finally appears and we see it for what it is, we have to pay attention, because even though it deconstructs us, it makes us into something new. It makes us into something hopefully better, though that can't be guaranteed. And even though Derrida seems like I mean, he is a real inspiration for me, and he seems like the source of this, the roots of this hauntology are much, much deeper. I mean, it's very clear that we live, in a country, for example, where we are deeply haunted by the presences of indigenous populations, or by the slave
Mhm.
trade, or there's so many different stories and narratives that have been repressed throughout history, and just in this country alone. And taking the time to listen to those ghosts is such a crucial, crucial piece of the work that we need to be doing. So even though Derrida is sort of a source, there's so many different people and voices that speak to me about a hauntology. When I hear critical voices about the policing in this country, or incarceration rates, or when we talk about repressed sexual groups, sexualities of groups, when we talk about race and injustices. There's so many issues where we are haunted constantly in this country by so many things. And even though Derrida is more of the philosophical voice, I'm deeply inspired by so many other writers and authors who have other ways that are sometimes much more profound and much more provocative than Derrida to let us realize what the ghosts are, who the ghosts are that are haunting us, that we need to pay attention to. I mean, like, I'm deeply moved by Audre Lorde's work, or I already mentioned Adrian Rich's work, or Paul Celan's work in German, writing about the hauntings of Judaism in Germany at the time. So there's just so many ways in which I could point to different people who speak to me too about that hauntology and the need to pay attention to our personal narratives and our voices.
Yeah. So for some of those thinkers like Derrida, maybe some more of the like philosophical thinkers like Derrida, and I know John Caputo is one who kind of carries forward Derrida's like hauntology. Is this in any way like in conversation with Freud and like repression? Are these thinkers kind of in conversation with Freud in that matter? Are they sort of drawing from him in any way?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Derrida himself was a major interlocutor with Freud's work. I think of his book on archive fever, which was a big inspiration for me with the work that I do. But yes, I mean, certainly the idea of repression as both a personal thing, but also a collective thing, part of society, is a
Mm-hmm.
huge piece of this. So yeah, in the work that I do, and especially in the classes I teach, I'm trying very hard to pay attention to these issues and these elements. I was just the other day rereading parts of Edward Said's lecture on Freud and the non-European other. And there's this strong sense that Said would take about being haunted in Europe by those non-Europeans who, he sees them on the edges of Freud's text. Africa's the dark continent that makes no
Mm-hmm.
sense. And how do we repress people from certain cultures in order to produce the narrative of Europe and its colonialist, imperialist
Mm-hmm.
dreams? So yeah, I mean, I think Freud opened that door for so many people, including Derrida, including Said, including, Spivak and so many others who were able to adopt, sort of a post-colonial approach or a feminist approach to work because they were looking specifically at Freud's thoughts on repression and then saying, wait, it's like society's repressed these people. And so, how can we read
Yeah, yeah,
that
yeah.
dynamic? How can we read that dynamic a little bit differently and in a more liberatory way? So, oh, certainly. I mean, I think you bringing up Freud is such a crucial piece. You definitely can mark the origins of a hauntology back to someone like Freud because it's a deeply, deeply psychological issue. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. So it's kind of some of these thinkers are kind of carrying forward, like the personal psychological elements that you find in Freud, but also extending those into like social and global realities. It sounds like.
Yes.
So, in your introduction to the book, you have this line where you say that we're haunted by ghosts because we need to be haunted by ghosts. So, I'm curious what you would say. What you would say about this? Like, why do we need to be haunted by ghosts? And then, maybe more specifically, with a view towards Christians or towards the church, why does the church or why do Christians today need to be haunted by ghosts?
Yeah, I love the question. Thank you for that. I feel like the big takeaway that I would grasp from someone like Derrida's work, but again, many others speak along the same lines, is that in fact, there are always going to be ghosts. There always are ghosts. There's never going to be a moment where we say, "Oh, I'm living a life that is ghost free." Like I've
Yeah,
achieved
yeah,
perfect existence of some kind. Like I'm not living on a land that's got an injustice embedded into the soil itself. I'm not living a life, an identity where there are things in my closet that might come out to haunt me. We're all going to have these hauntings taking place, whether it's something personally in our past, if it's familial, if it's something that's a scar that we bear based on some trauma in our past, or whether it's again like a social collective injustice or something that's a violence that's been perpetrated and then attempted to cover it up. These things are always going to be there. So the first thing I would always say to myself is, well, there are ghosts everywhere in my life. I just need to
Mhm.
start seeing them and paying attention to them, and then
Hmm.
realizing, oh my God, there were other ghosts that I didn't even recognize. And I think, for some people that experience comes very, it's very normal and natural, sadly, that they can recognize the ghosts immediately, maybe through a violence or a trauma or something in the past. But for other people, especially those like myself, who were raised white, heterosexual, tall, American male. It's very
Mm-hmm.
difficult. Sometimes we say, well, oh, there are no ghosts. I'm living a great existence. Then you realize, oh, that I was in denial and completely ignoring realities around me.
Sure.
Um, so there becomes this, I think, extreme importance to stress how no one's living a ghost-free existence. No one's not being haunted. And when you think you are, this is the psychological insight, when you think you are living a life free of those hauntings, rest assured you're really being haunted. You just are completely ignoring those. And that's something that I find so vital to focus on, because as you asked about Christians in particular, so many traditions, especially Christianity in the West, have been perpetrators of great violences, and there
Mm-hmm.
are ghosts following them around that they don't even realize are there. And so taking the time to say, hold on, how are we complicit with structures of power and oppression? Or how has this tradition in particular, among other traditions that might intersect, how have we been complicit with violences that are still being, perpetrated upon particular groups or persons? And what does that mean? And what does that look like? And I feel like that is such a vital question to go into. It's such an important thing. And yet we spend so little time talking about that. So I tend to get frustrated sometimes when I'm speaking to Christian theologians in particular, when you talk about, the possibility of deconstructing a certain sovereign image of God or of Christians. And there's such resistance and there's such fear that there's a, loss of a culture of
Yeah.
Christendom, culture war that needs to take place, when we need to confront the ghosts that are following the Christian tradition. And how can we claim we're going to speak about a God who conquers death if we're busy ignoring the people who died, or the ghosts that are following us all around? So that for me becomes a big part of also the work I do and want to do more of. I hope that
Mm-hmm.
answers your question in part, at least.
No, it definitely does. Yeah, no, it's interesting because you sort of structure the book according to like all these various hauntings that you see in different areas. So like each chapter of the book is devoted to some different kind of hauntings, right? So you have like chapters on the haunting of continental philosophy, of the sovereign self, of the church, and then of our words and of our writing. So I want to maybe start by talking about the haunting of continental philosophy. So, what are maybe one or two ways you see it being haunted, or maybe one or two ghosts you see in the closet of continental philosophy?
Oh yeah, goodness, there's so many. I mean,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
one of the I last spring I was helping organize a colloquium on our campus about the limits of continental philosophy, and we were inviting speakers from different parts of the world to speak about how continental philosophy has been disseminated historically through Catholic universities in the West, and that enabled continental philosophy to spread in some cases quite well in non-European contexts. So I've got very good friends and colleagues in Brazil and South Africa, and obviously in other Anglo parts of the world. But there's these pockets where Catholicism, through obvious missions of colonialization, um, Catholicism sort of paved the way for continental philosophy to be used as a philosophical introduction to the West and to Christian theologies, specifically. And so we were looking at this saying, well, it's so interesting that you can have like a professor in Indonesia, for example, who will be teaching Heidegger, and you're thinking, why not use some, indigenous philosophies from Indonesia or from other parts of Southeast Asia, or, et cetera, or African philosophies in parts of Africa. And it's a really relevant question. Why has continental philosophy spread so far and wide across the globe? And the obvious answer is because of colonialism and Western imperialism. And well, then, but what do you do with that history and that legacy? And how does a tradition look at its ghosts, that the people who are speaking other philosophies who have been basically eradicated due to genocide and oppression and so many other factors? So I obviously am deeply committed to the continental philosophical tradition. It's where I come from. It's what I was trained in, and I love it. But at the same time, sometimes it acts as if there's no other conversation happening, or people who are in the field of continental philosophy may, go about their work never thinking about engaging in some sort of comparative philosophical exercise. And of course, that starts with me. I have to look at my own work and say, wow, how am I limited in what I do by my refusal or my, ignorance to engage with other traditions. So that for me is a big part of seeing the ghosts or the others to continental philosophy. But then there's the other sense too of the ones that are already within the tradition. I mean, how many times have I been told by a colleague who really doesn't know continental philosophy something along the lines of, "Oh, you can't study Heidegger anymore. He was a Nazi and that, an anti-Semite, and that taints his
Yeah.
entire legacy." And I'm not going to contest those claims. Obviously, his black notebooks don't look good, but at the
Yeah.
same time, I'm going to look at it and say, like with anybody, there are things here that are brilliant, things here that are good, and there are things here that are not. And I need to know the difference between the two. I need to see if there's something good to recover, and I need to see what ghosts haunt his legacy, and even read biographies of Heidegger, and try to figure out
Mhm.
what exactly is the impact of this person on the way in which we do our work. Because someone like Derrida's work was deeply influenced by Heidegger, and
Yeah.
Derrida was deeply influential toward feminist philosophers of the last 50, 60 years. I need to know that legacy if I'm going to take seriously what continental philosophy represents today. So, yeah, there's numerous things, both internal and external ghosts, so to speak, that need to be assessed and looked at in that respect.
Yeah, yeah. Heidegger especially is interesting just because he taught like so many major thinkers in continental philosophy. So it's and so many of them like position their work as like a response or a reaction to like his ideas of intersubjectivity, for instance. So it's really that whole like historical lineage is really fascinating to follow.
It is.
Uh, Go
It
ahead.
is very much. Well, I just say it is,
Yeah,
but it's also, I just finished reading a book by Mitchell on the fourfold, Heidegger's late thought. And it's so
yeah,
interesting to see how he develops a whole different way of thinking toward the end of his life, where he's sort of working against the reductive dualisms in his earlier existential thought. It's no longer just authenticity and inauthenticity, it's complex. There's a
right.
fourfold. It seems almost mythological in its origins. It's like, yeah, I appreciate seeing that difference, and I wanna know what it means to mature as a thinker.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious too what you would say about because there are all I think there are all these really interesting thinkers, especially from like the global south, who are engaging with continental philosophy, maybe were trained in continental philosophy, but are trying to refigure it according to kind of, the places they themselves come from. So someone like Ashio Mbembe, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm not totally sure.
I think so,
But
yeah.
but it's interesting because I feel like those thinkers still haven't. I mean, to the extent that I am aware, they haven't really. It doesn't seem like they're figured on like syllabi very much, right? Like, I don't think I've ever seen Mbembe on syllabi. So it seems like in the academy in the West, when it comes to like continental philosophy, it's still just so much like Heidegger, Derrida, Levinas, who are all good and worth reading for sure. But I'm curious what you think are like the barriers to some of these voices being more widely read and considered, particularly in the context of the academy in the West.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the first thing I would say is I have seen Mbembe on syllabi, multiple syllabi, and
Oh,
I
nice.
use him as well here and there. You'll see Edward Said's work. You'll see a variety of thinkers who represent sort of an engagement with continental thinkers, but they do so from quote unquote outside the continental fold to some degree
Yeah,
too. And that's happening more and more. Now, is it everybody? No.
yeah,
And some of that's just a result of, academic disciplines and the way in which it takes people a long time to change. But oh my goodness, with especially, younger generations of scholars, there is more and more and more engagement with non-white, non-Western voices, and it's beautiful to see. It's the
mhm,
most vibrant, wonderful work that you will see. And for me, it's comparable in the field of theology to those who are doing what I think is probably the only one of the only fields in theology I'm even interested in reading, which is queer theology or some forms
mhm,
of queer theologies. This stuff is absolutely fascinating. It's wonderful to read and engage with. It's exciting. It's different. It's new. But yeah, it's going to take a while for that guard to change. So the fact that we're having a conversation as two white guys, but we're talking about Mbembe's work, even if just in part, is already a step in that direction. I
yeah,
think it's just going to
yeah,
take more time. It's going to take more people reading necropolitics or critique of Black reason and
yeah,
saying, oh, you know what? I need to read more of this figure, and who's he reading, and how could I, be attracted to some other thinkers? And then you start asking around, and someone says, oh, you should read Felwine Sarr or some others, like who represent African philosophy today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then we begin to learn and to grow, and that's a beautiful thing. But I just think it takes time, and some of that, of course, is the limitations of academic disciplines.
Yeah.
I've been on committees where we talk about funding. It's like, how many more dissertations do we need on Augustine? I mean, really, like how many
Yeah.
do we need? But it's like, and how many more do we, really need these days on thinkers who are doing radical and amazing stuff that we're not even, you're really not seeing any books about at all. Sylvia Wynter's work. I just saw a book the other day being published on Sylvia Wynter and religion, and I thought, okay, here we go. Like, here's a Caribbean thinker, theorist whose work is being appreciated and recognized. And that's something that's going to have an impact on people working in a Caribbean and U.S. context a lot more than it would have had even 50 years ago. So that's the kind of thing that it excites me. That's why we need to look at the limits of continental thought in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, it is encouraging to see some of those things taking hold for sure. Okay, so the haunting of the sovereign self. I want to talk about that now. That I think that's your next chapter in the book, and that in that chapter you talk a lot about fetishes. So I'm curious what role you see fetishes playing in like our constructions of a sovereign self. What would you say about that?
Yeah, and I wrote a whole book trying to figure that out for myself too. The fetish of theology. I was curious about how when you present yourself as a sovereign figure, there come these moments where you're not able to reconcile the deep ambiguities of identity and power and the various tensions we reside in, where we can't often we can't reconcile them, we can't make sense of them, and yet we know something's off. And I was very curious about how there's this desire within academia to provide sort of one theory that will explain it all. You've got your Freudians or your Marxists or various
Mhm.
people that say here's the way it all fits together. And I was deeply moved by reading Hartmut Baim's book on fetish. Is it the fetish of modernity? I think that's the title. Um, sorry, I got a fire truck going by here.
You're
Um,
good.
he writes about how, in many ways, in the world of theory, so continental thinkers and comparative literature people, and how in many ways the field of theory has become obsessed with finding the right approach, the right perspective. It's almost as if
Mm,
theory itself has been fetishized. And I thought,
yeah.
oh, is this part of my own deep fascination with this world of theory? Like, why I find myself I got to read more continental philosophy and try to understand what's the right critique to take and how does that affect
Mhm.
me? But then at the same time, am I fetishizing it? Am I fetishizing the philosophical perspective, the philosopher position? Is that how I see myself? And oh my goodness, what am I doing? And then I began to think, there's more to this that I need to look into. So what I've noticed in particular was the more I delved into that work of what is fetishism in the modern period, it became clear that it's just such a malleable and fascinating term because it jumps across disciplines. You've got early anthropologists and ethnographers who are studying indigenous cultures and saying these objects are fetishes. They're not actually sacred objects. They're not like a Eucharistic host. They are, a
Mhm.
false god, so to speak. And then you have Karl Marx who comes in and says, that idea of valuing a material thing more than its actual value is also really applicable to the economic sphere. And then you have Freud who comes in and says, "Oh, it's not just economics or religion; it's psychological. People develop these sexualized fetishes they hold on to as a way to compensate for the ambiguities in their life that they can't sort out or find some sort
Mhm.
of resolution to." And I began to think, "Oh my God, that permeates not just the world of theory; it permeates theology. How does theology itself have to have an answer for everything? Have to say this is who God really is? Have to resolve the ambiguities that can never really be resolved?" So I was writing about that and thinking it's just such a central concept. Whenever we try to have a sovereign view and say, this is where power lies, this is where I want to be, this is how I want to see myself. To do that, we have to sort of have a fetish in order to like
Yeah.
sustain this sovereign sense of self. And so it's not a surprise that you notice with people who are not striving to be sovereign, there's less incentive to fetishize. There's less need, I should say, to create a little fetish on the side to help support that image. And that's why I would read some books like Mallory's book on fetishism from an African perspective, and he was writing about, at one point he talked about the BDSM community. He's like, this is such a white person thing. He's like, you know, the legacy of my people, we're not really fetishizing being tied up. He's like, we were tied up. We were literally.
Yeah, yeah,
This is not our thing. And I loved that. It was just such a beautiful critique that brings it home and says these moments of trying to create a little fetish on the side to sustain our sovereign sense of self. It's a game that has to be revealed for what it is. And I think theology, as much as any other field, maybe more so, has to confront that part of its own legacy and how it doesn't want to be deconstructed. It doesn't want to face its limitations. It would rather construct a sovereign sense of God and of its theological claims and its doctrinal claims and continue on as always. But then I would ask, what are the fetishes in its own closet? Because my goodness, most religious people I know, there's something there.
yeah.
So that's part of my critique, the lived experience of seeing Christians claim they're morally pure, but then nope, there's something. And the more morally pure they are, the more that you're pretty sure there's something dark going on beneath the surface.
I think that's what you're talking about with this almost like obsession to find the thinker you want to align yourself with or something. Like I think this is especially a temptation for academics or like grad students. I know for myself, I've experienced that too. And it really is obsessive. I think that's a good word to describe it. Like this, and this obsession of theory as like being able to offer, to like pin down all the answers you're looking for in life. I thought that was really interesting what you said about that.
Yeah, I think people, I especially my red flags go up when people particularly get obsessed with isms. This is a movement. This is part of nominalism, or this is Gnosticism. This attempt to label and dismiss. We sort of fetishize these identification labels. But yeah, you're right. We can do it with thinkers or theorists or a particular realm of theory or a discipline because we're sort of bearing an insecurity that no one talks about or acknowledge. And my God, academics are some of those insecure people I've ever met in my life. Like on the whole, I mean, I have wonderful colleagues, but they really can be because you want to put forward a sense of yourself as a scholar, as a researcher who, I know these things. I've mastered this knowledge. I'm an expert, quote unquote. But that often is done by producing these fetishes to desperately cling to so that we can pretend we know more than we actually do. Something like that.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it. Okay, so which thinkers, searching for more thinkers to align ourselves with, which thinkers do you see as being like particularly helpful for maybe kind of starting to unravel or undo these rigidly constructed like visions of our sovereign self?
Yeah, I mean, a great question. And I've spent most of my career, reading continental philosophy sort of as a whole. And I feel like the whole field right now has been just, obsessed with this deconstructing or unraveling of our normative ideas, sort of going back to Nietzsche in the late 19th century and Kierkegaard's resistance to Christendom. You have this attempt to deconstruct the normative identities of society or normative moralities or normative, nationalisms or, all kinds of things like that. So there's so many thinkers that I could name that have been, influential for me. And I guess I'll just name, even though I read very broadly in the field, I think the ones that have been most helpful have been some of the genealogists. You've got the Nietzsche, Foucault, and Agamben types who point out that the genealogy is not quite as cohesive as people might take it to be. And then you have the deconstructivists, Derrida, and sort of people who follow his work, like Jeff Bennington and some others who are really good at pointing out the capacity and potential of deconstructive abilities. But I also feel like, and I should say Jean-Luc Nancy sort of fits a little bit in that mold for me as well, and Nancy's work is great. I love seeing when it crosses over into other fields, like where Lucia Garay or Judith Butler take it into more feminist direction. That's been very influential for me. or some people who read it with a more psychoanalytic bent. Eric Santner's work has been deeply influential for me, and as has Slavoj Žižek's, obviously, is quite powerful and at times, very repetitive at times in a Lacanian vein. I would say those are probably some of the more influential in that in that psychological approach. But then obviously for me too, the critical theory
Mm-hmm.
strand is very influential. So Walter Benjamin and Adorno, they've been very influential on the way that I do my work and the way I think about these things. I find Adorno to be to me, he's like reading Hegel. It's just, wisdom drips out of every sentence, and
Mm-hmm.
it's just
Mm-hmm.
amazing insights to be culled from not a wasted word in his corpus. Yeah, so those have been some of the more influential ones for me, and yeah, I could name others, but those are the ones that hit me pretty hard.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Okay, so turning to the church's haunting. So you in that chapter you introduce this kind of tension between or I should say within religion between like the legalistic on the one hand and the prophetic on the other. Or I think you also used language of a canonical impulse and a messianic impulse. So I guess in your view, where do you think religious people get themselves in trouble with that, with the former, with that legalistic or that canonical impulse?
Yeah, and I guess I should say too, I think they get themselves in trouble on both extremes. But I think what happens in general, and I was borrowing the legalistic prophetic tension was a phrase that Paul Ricoeur used in his book Symbolism of Evil, and he talked about how there's this temptation just simply within Judaism between those two poles, and both are extremes. And I feel like one of the things we still have trouble talking about or even knowing how to talk about is how religious, especially religions that have canonical normative scriptures, but also have doctrinal canonical claims, have trouble sort of saying, well, what is the role of that canonical legal principle within our work, and where are its limits? Where do we see come up against itself in a way that's not always helpful or life-giving or life-affirming? And so I've been fascinated by like the work of Jakob Taubes or Gershom Scholem's work, or the discussions that they have about where normative legal measures come up against the challenger, the antinomian, challenger to the system. And I've been fascinated by the way in which religious people, I think, tend to, and I'm talking about monotheism specifically, tend to have such a love for the canonical measure, the scriptural norm, this reverence and
Mm-hmm.
awe and sacrality that surrounds it, and doctrinal claims or living life according to a particular law can be so helpful in cementing a person's identity or feeling part of a community. But at the same time, I think there's always going to be this non-normative or anti-normative antinomian challenge that rises up from within, the messianic element, the prophetic element that calls into question the entire system. And I think that's extreme, and you can't live out a permanent antinomian existence. It's not a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
But those are moments where we're being asked to re-examine the system, re-examine the norms, re-examine the laws, and to say maybe we're a little too strict in adhering to some of these, or maybe there's a injustice being perpetrated against certain persons or groups through these normative systems or identities, and we need to loosen them or re-examine them or something along those lines. And you'll have moments where those challenges sound nihilistic. I'm thinking of like Black nihilism's movements, like Calvin Warren's great work on this, or
Mm-hmm.
Afro-pessimism, like you'll see in so many authors. There's more just a sense of let's just take down the whole system. And I can be very sympathetic to that as an astute reader of continental philosophy, that we need to have these deconstructive acts and we do need to pay attention to where we're haunted. But yeah, we're always going to return to a system. We're going to have laws. We're going to have identities. We're going to have community, and sort of the values of that community will be represented. But there are these moments where I think, especially for religious people, the temptation is so great to pretend as if their normative system, their orthodoxy, is going to last forever in the same way it's always been. And that's just not
Yeah.
how it
Yeah.
works. You read John Henry Newman on the development of doctrine, and you say, this is not how, we do develop over time. Everything develops over time. Everything changes over time. And it's our attempt to prevent those changes that actually will create the problems, long term. Do we have to have people who defend the systems and the laws and the norms? Yes, of course. And we need to cherish and value those traditions too, while also realizing that they're going to fall apart at times. They're going to need to be
Yeah.
re-examined, going to have to change and open up and become more hospitable to the the non-represented other who lays outside the system. So, yeah, I would say the great temptation of religion, and I'm speaking very generally here, like recklessly general, but the great temptation with religion is to make a normative structure and to sort of absolutize it and then pretend as if it can't be challenged in any way and to say that's orthodoxy. But it's going to be challenged. And so I think we need to get better at having those conversations about where do things fall apart and what do we do when they do fall apart and what are the conditions of the falling apart. And let's talk about that. How do we listen to voices of the others who we're not listening to? And they're always going to be there. So how are we going to get better at listening to them, wherever they may come up from? And how can complaints be heard and registered and arbitrated? And
Yeah.
what kinds of courts will be in place to say these voices need to be given more representation and so on and so forth? Because I think even at the base of like our environmental problems comes this very strong sense that we're not listening to the non-human others
Yeah.
all around us every day. We're being haunted by animals and trees and the weather, and we're not listening. And we just keep going about our lives the same as we always do, as destructive as that is. So, how are we
Mhm.
going to get better at this? Can we form political systems that are actually letting non human others have representation politically? Oh, my goodness. And we need to, but I think most people would say, what? You're going to give bears and fish the right to vote in Congress? It's like, well, yeah, maybe. Maybe we need to start having that conversation, because we're wrecking habitats and acting as if it's not a big deal. So yeah, I think that's going to be a major question that isn't just haunting us now. I think it's going to it's going to get louder and louder over the next 100, 200 years, assuming the human race is still around.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Okay, how about the chapter you have on hunting our words? In particular, I wanna talk about the, words in the context of, like, this kinda language of faith. So do you think that faith requires an acknowledgement of, like, the fragility of religious language? Obviously, you see a lot of, like, the quote, "faithful not" acknowledging the fragility of their own religious language, right? Having this very, like, strongman approach to their own words about their faith. But do you see faith as in some way requiring this acknowledgement of the fragility of religious language, and then also of maybe those conceptions of ourselves that are based really firmly on kind of the particular religious vocabularies that we're involved in?
Yeah, I think this is actually it's a great point to make, and it's a great question. I think one of the things I was hinting at a little bit ago is that Orthodox religious perspectives or religious languages often have a great deal of trouble acknowledging that, like that they have limits, that there are things
Yeah.
that are going to change. And I think if you look at faith itself as change, if faith itself is something that's constantly evolving, that's a beautiful thing, not a thing to fear. I'm thinking of Christian Wyman's memoir, My Bright Abyss, which is a beautiful memoir on faith and his struggles with cancer. And he talks about that's how he defines it, I think, faith as change. And I think about it in the sense of one of the things I often say to my students, is it a good idea when we lose faith in a particular image of God? And it's you can see the uncomfortability in people's eyes, and I don't know if
Mhm.
I want to say that. And it's like, well, do we acknowledge the apophatic truth that every image of God is idolatrous to some degree, that every representation of the divine is not going to be the divine? Well, if we
Mhm.
accept that as a basic principle, which is not hard to do, because if if there is a God, it's the ultimate mystery and it's infinite and it goes beyond any understanding, et cetera, et cetera. Why would we have a problem acknowledging that then whatever word we use is going to be to some degree idolatrous? To some degree, it's going to be inaccurate. And I think religious language is this absolute paradox of we're trying to say something, intelligible and cohesive about something that cannot ever be described in intelligent terms. And there's this constant resistance on the part of religion to deny that reality to some degree, to say, no, we can articulate this. We do have a position to stake. And I'm not saying we should never try to do that, but every time we do, as many mystics throughout the centuries have made abundantly clear, we're always failing. And I think recognizing those failures as the key to the faith, the fragility in that sense of religious language, is absolutely crucial. It's a willingness to admit with humility and with foresight that we don't know what we're talking about, and we need to constantly keep that in the front of our conversations, not just as an asterisk disclaimer, but it's what drives it. It's really what drives everything we do. I mean, how many times do I hear someone say, "Oh, if Jesus came back, he'd be appalled at the state of the church"? And it's like people kind of, whether they're conservative or liberal, kind of go, "Yeah, that's true." And it's like, well, if we can acknowledge that, and we know that's what's happening, we know he was much more challenging to normative religious structures of his day. Why would he not be so today? There's something he wants beyond all these structures. We sort of know that. And yet we have such trouble admitting that changes the way in which we present and practice faith in the present. So I would very much say that recognizing the fragility of all religious language is sort of the beginning point of where to have a conversation about religious language. And I think that's a beautiful thing, not a bad thing. It's actually what opens us up to the other person before us, rather than foreclosing the relationship and not moving it any further in depth. So yeah.
Yeah. So if one were to kind of follow this road of like apophatic theology, do you think that road like inevitably leads to a loss of faith or a loss of like involvement in institutional religion? Like, do you think it kind of inevitably leads to like almost an atheism?
Well, I mean, I've taught it many times before. I'm teaching my class on atheism and secularism right now, and we
Nice.
continuously discuss this issue. I think to some degree, yeah. And we need to be open and honest about that and talk about that and say, when we challenge these things, and if that is part of what religion is about, we need to be open and honest about how losing your faith is part of one's faith. It's not something separate from it. And I think so many religious people live in a fear that they're going to lose their faith and they'll never come back, instead of saying, what would it mean to teach people that loss, that in some ways that amazing maturing loss is actually part of the process itself. And it seems like Christianity should be, above all, perfectly poised to represent the importance of that. When you have a God who cries out on the cross, "My God, where have you gone? You've abandoned me." I mean, this idea of losing what we thought faith was seems to absolutely capture the apostles' experience of thinking Jesus is one way, then discovering he's not that way, and then feeling like he's absolutely gone, and then having to have a encounter with the resurrected Jesus to have to rethink it all. Disillusionment follows Christianity everywhere. It haunts it. There we go. and it's like we need to get a lot more honest in the Christian tradition about the necessity of that haunting, the necessity of that loss of faith as constitutive of someone's faith, that it's not something to fear, that it's something to learn how to work with, and that's okay. And I think in the midst of doing that, we can also learn new ways to have trust and hope and faith and love. And it's not some rosy, romanticized vision of relationships. It's a realistic one. It's one that says, I'm going to be here in the toughest of times and when there's great suffering. And that's a beautiful thing. It's actually, we're forged in a very different way in those experiences.
Yeah, that's all said. Okay, so in that final chapter in your book on the haunting of writing, you're looking at kind of Jean-Luc Marion's distinction between autobiography and heterobiography, which I think that comes from his book on Saint Augustine, if I'm not mistaken. But how would you describe heterobiography, and in what ways might that constitute a haunting of the narratives that we construct about ourselves and the narratives that we sort of by which we sort of try to understand ourselves?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm deeply intrigued by Marion's distinction. The autobiography, the way he puts it, seems like the ultimate sovereign gesture. It's as if I'm a completely autonomous self who's going to write my story about myself by myself.
Right.
The heterobiography is sort of the opposite approach. It's a willingness to say, my story is not just my story. My version of myself is absolutely shot through and intersects with other stories, other lives. And I need to pay attention to those because they do speak about who I am and the world that I'm coming from. I feel like we're beginning to change slowly our way of understanding biographies, personal biographies, and even our own stories, our autobiographies, to let more voices in. So to let that otherness that haunts us become more center to the story. And that's really hard to do, but I think we are learning to do that. I was thinking of how it's on my shelf in a different room, but there's a more recent biography of Abraham Lincoln that's, like trying to show how Lincoln's life is so deeply impacted by all these other things happening at that time in this culture. So each chapter is like not just about Lincoln, but it's about these other important, aspects of culture that were speaking
Yeah.
to his life, and that's a powerful piece of his story. Then you've got like I think it's Moser's biography of Fernando Pessoa, the Portuguese writer. Similarly, it goes into the great depth about his life, being impacted by the things in his culture in his life that may have had ostensibly nothing to do with his autobiography, but they shape the entire way in which he's coming up. So I think we're seeing this even in the genre of biography, literally. But I think also it's, to me, such a great point about listening to the forces that intersect and shape us into who we are and allowing them to have a more prominent role in the things we're writing about ourselves and the way in which we understand our own story and so on and so forth. And so for me, and I didn't fully get into this in that book, but because it's more personal, but for me, even the way in which I do theology or the way I do it, the way I write it, it's a deeply personal thing that's about how I'm confronting and facing part of myself and my life. So if I'm writing about the deconstruction of Christianity using Continental philosophers, it's because I'm looking at that in myself. I'm looking at how it's being taken apart, but I'm also how it may be built up in different ways. And that's what I'm doing when I'm teaching a class on atheism right now. And at the same time, I'm teaching a class on the history of mysticism. It's like these are not so different in terms of the way we end up. They're actually quite similar to have the people who reject religion saying things that are very eerily similar to those who are quote unquote having the closest experiences of God. It's like these are really not wholly dissimilar things. They're actually quite overlapping. So the heterobiography, I think, is such an important thing to turn to these days and say, well, how is our story not just our story, and how are these narratives that we speak about when we talk about ourselves, how are they really implicated in other lives, and how are others implicated in our lives? So any sort of interdependent relationship is illuminated through that heterobiographical narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, I mean, this has been a really rich conversation. I want to give you a chance, as we kind of come to a close here, to share about any works you might have in progress or anything else you might like to plug here.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I did, like I said, I finished a book not too long ago about Agamben's Homo Sacer series with Edinburgh University Press, and obviously, if you're interested in Agamben's work, that'd be a good one. I wrote that book on the fetish of theology, and another one on theological poverty and continental philosophy. I did another one on theology's autobiography. I think those would be maybe helpful ones to get a sense of some of what I've been doing. And I have a book coming out with Cascade, hopefully next year, on pilgrimage in a Roman context, where I'm talking about, and by the way, this one is more personal, autobiographical, but it's talking about how my life was converging at specific points with going to Rome and being there on pilgrimage and teaching classes on pilgrimage while I was in Rome with students. And what does it mean to be a pilgrim? What does it mean to be a tourist? What does it mean to be caught between the secular and the sacred when you're in, one of the holiest cities for Catholicism, and going into the pilgrim churches and the various churches of Rome. So that one, to me, it was a deeply personal autobiographical work, but also one that couldn't separate the autobiographical from the encounters with these sacred spaces in Rome. So that one will be coming out with Cascade at some point next year. And then I also did write a book with Bloomsbury that'll be coming out next year on atheism and love in the modern age, and about how atheism and religion are not so different when you think about where they overlap conceptually. And I focus on the idea of indifference, how a true atheism, I think, is an indifference to religion, But a true spiritual religion will often talk about love as the practice of indifference. And so I get into different writers like Kierkegaard, who write about love and the work of love as a work that is indifferent to certain things so that it can love better. And so I don't think there's a great difference between those two, not as great of a difference between atheism and love as people might think. So that's another.
I actually stumbled upon your project on pilgrimage, like just in our internal database, and so I was kind of poking around in the
Great.
early parts of the manuscript, and it looks really, really lovely. So I'm excited to see it kind of go through the publication process and see it in print. Well, Colby, I just want to say thank you for taking the time. Really enjoyed this conversation. Appreciate you taking some time out of your day to chat. So thank you very much for coming on.
Oh, no problem at all. Thank you for having me.